Good morning and welcome to SIS. My name is Carole Gallaher and I'm the Senior Associate Dean here. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Spotlight on Secession Movements. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. This virtual event will last about an hour and 15 minutes with a Q&A session towards the end. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at any time in the bottom of your Zoom window. Answers to questions will not be typed in the Q&A function, but the closed captions will include the responses. We also ask that no one record this session. We will be automatically recording the webinar and will upload it to the SIS YouTube channel shortly after the event. Also, this event is part of the Jean Monnet in the USA series, an impressive lineup of events hosted by the network of EU-funded universities, which AU is a part of, thanks to the Transatlantic Policy Center, which we're delighted to have here. So let me now turn to introducing our panelists for today. Kimberly Cowell Myers is Professor of Government in the School of Public Affairs and affiliated faculty with the Women in Politics Institute and the Transatlantic Policy Center at AU. She's also my writing partner in crime, so it's my pleasure to introduce her. Nicola McEwen, Professor of Territorial Politics at the University of Edinburgh and co-director of the Center on Constitutional Change. Thanks for coming to us from a different time zone, Nicola. Marc Sanjaume, Professor of Political Science at the Université Oberta de Catalunya, is also coming to us from another time zone. Thank you so much for being here. And Daniel Turp, Professor Honoraire of the Faculty of Law at the Université de Montréal. Thank you all for being here. And as soon as everyone's on the screen, we'll get started. All right, okay, so Nicola, do you want to put your camera on, if you can do that? So while she's doing that, we'll go ahead and just get started. So hello, oh good, we all made it. So I wanted to start with a round robin for all of us, just to give the audience some background on the various places that we're going to be talking about today. So all of you study places, Catalan, Scotland, Quebec, Northern Ireland, where some citizens don't feel they belong in the country in which they are located. Why is that? And Daniel, I'll start with you.
D'abord, salutations de Montréal au Québec, and thank you for you and your center and the American University having this event. And I say hello to my friends in Scotland and Catalunya and in Washington. Well, I guess from the Quebec perspective, there's many reasons. They can be economic, social, cultural, even environmental now. People in Quebec have, for many years had many reasons and brought about many reasons to look at independence as a solution and as its future political status. But I would say there's three main reasons now. There's reasons of the linguistic nature. Being in Canada is very difficult when it comes to promoting and protecting the French language. There's been obstacles, including in the Canadian Constitution, which says that Canada is bilingual and makes people very wary of the idea that French should be the official language of Quebec, the main and common language of Quebec. There's also issues about, major social policies. For example, there's a big debate now in Quebec about secularism. Quebec has adopted a legislation on secularism. It's challenged now in view that Canada should be a multicultural state, and some limitations on freedoms and the freedom of religion should not be acceptable in such a context. And lastly, there's this issue that Quebec would like to speak through its own voice in international organizations and conclude its own treaties and presents its own views with its own values within the international community.
I want to ask you a quick follow-up question. I've never heard anyone describe environmental issues as one reason for people in Quebec not feeling connected. Could you elaborate on that just a bit?
Well, for example, when it comes to climate change, Canada has had policies under not only conservative governments, the previous conservative government of Stephen Harper, but even now the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau is really supporting the production of oil, and not very clean oil and petrol in the western part of Canada. Quebec has had a very consistent policy of favoring, renewable energy. It's lucky that it has a lot of hydroelectricity. So when Canada promotes, even in the international scene, policies that do not favor climate change, when Canada, for example, withdraws from the Kyoto Protocol, that's a reason why Quebecers say Quebec should be a country, because it wouldn't do that.
Oh, thanks. That's great to hear. I understand that better. Nicola, what about Scotland?
I think with Scotland, national identity doesn't really divide in the same way that your question implies. And that, what I mean by that is that it's such a prevalent identity, regardless of where people stand on the constitutional issue, regardless of whether people see Scotland as seeing its future as part of the United Kingdom or moving towards independent statehood. And so, although the status of Scotland as a nation within the United Kingdom does matter, and the extent to which that nationhood is recognised, not just symbolically, but politically, that issue of voice that Daniel mentioned in relation to Quebec matters a lot in the Scottish context. Voice within the United Kingdom, but also in the extent to which there is scope for voice internationally. And we saw that most significantly in relation to the Brexit referendum. We'll probably come on to that in discussion a little bit later. But I would say that there isn't a whole lot of evidence that people in Scotland, even those who are broadly favourable towards independence, don't feel they belong to the United Kingdom or don't feel any sort of attachment. Their Scottish identity is stronger and they simply see a different democratic future. But it's an issue that divides Scotland, so we're not certainly not unanimous in that sense.
Right. Thank you. Marc, how about Catalan?
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for organizing this seminar. Yeah, I agree with what Professors Turp and McEwen already said. I think we are talking here about two different questions, or like a short answer and a long answer. Why Catalans do not feel Spanish, or why many Catalans do not feel Spanish, or they feel Catalan and Spanish at the same time, is a very long story, and would require almost an entire seminar on that. So Catalonia, it's a minority nation within Spain, and that's a reality. There is a history, an economy, a social structure, cultural background, a language that form this national reality within Spain. That's one question. And then in the 19th century, we experienced and we saw how this movement or this identity transformed into a political movement. That was in the 19th century. And since then, we have had this identity within, this political identity within Spain. That's one question. But this political identity, at least in the Catalan case, and I think that it's also true for Quebec, this political identity could be could not be a problem. I mean, it could be within Spain, and it can exist within Spain with no political conflict, or at least with a less political conflict. However, if we ask about why this particular political movement is secessionist, then I think that we shouldn't look at this national identity per se as an explanatory variable. We should look at the institutional setting of the Spanish state and how political power is distributed in Spain. I think those are the key variables when we talk about secessionism in Catalonia. Catalan national identity, well, it exists, it will continue to exist, and it existed in the past, and in the past many Catalans were pro-autonomy, and they felt more or less okay within Spain. But nowadays, what we see is that Spain became a democracy 40 years ago, and that was celebrated. That was a great achievement for all Spaniards. It was a third wave democracy after 4 years of Franco dictatorship. During Franco dictatorship in Spain, Catalan language and Catalan political movements were prosecuted, as you know. And with the achievement of democracy in Spain, Catalan political movements and Catalan demands were somehow tolerated. What happens now is that 40 years later, Catalans feel like this democracy, the Spanish democracy, is not enough in terms of territorial distribution of power. So Catalonia amounts for almost 1/5 of Spanish wealth, Spanish GDP. Catalonia has a very important weight within Spain, also with the city of Barcelona as the capital of Catalonia. And the Catalans feel that after 40 years, they do not have leverage in Madrid. So we should look at, my argument is that we should look at the specific territorial model in Spain and why Spain became a democracy, and that was okay, but why it failed to accommodate these power demands from the periphery, also from the Basques and from the Galicians.
Thank you. Kimberly, what about Northern Ireland?
I had to find my unmute button. Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. My husband says I can weave Northern Ireland into any conversation, so I'm very glad to have some time to do that with you all, and grateful to AU for hosting and to all my fellow panelists for their participation. So when we talk about Northern Ireland, we typically talk about two groups of people, the Unionists and the Nationalists, and they are divided on a number of different dimensions. One of them is the sectarian dimension. So we typically think of Unionists as being mostly Protestant and Nationalists as being mostly Catholic. But there's also this sort of ethno-nationalist dimension where Unionists tend to see themselves as, if not British, at least part of the United Kingdom appropriately. They see themselves maybe as members of the state of Northern Ireland, whereas nationalists more typically will see themselves as Irish. And this stems back into the history of the creation of Northern Ireland, which occurred 100 years ago this year. And Northern Ireland was carved out of the rest of Ireland when the rest of Ireland was set on a path for independence. The time at which Northern Ireland was created, 2/3 of the Northern Ireland was Protestant. And it was deliberately created to be a kind of Protestant majority state. And that meant, of course, that there was 1/3 of the population who were left on the margins. And so we talk about this sort of tension between Unionists who see themselves as part of the United Kingdom and they want Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, and nationalists who see themselves as Irish and would like Northern Ireland to go away and be absorbed into some form of a united Ireland. They differ not only on those dimensions already mentioned, but also on their relationship to the institutions, as Marc mentions, where Northern Ireland as a Protestant-dominated state became really like almost an apartheid state in which nationalists had very little representation and were divided from Unionists in terms of class, economic opportunity, political opportunity, etc. So there are, well, actually centuries of division, but most acutely in the past century, a pattern of institutional development, at least up until the 1960s, 1970s, that left nationalists feeling as if they were very much underrepresented and underappreciated, and their identity not either accepted, valued, or even in some instances, the expression of it legal in Northern Ireland. So a failure of nation building, a failure of democracy, democratic institutions that were unrepresentative, led to, as I'm sure people know, the troubles in Northern Ireland, a civil conflict there between Unionists and nationalists, if you will. So that conflict, the violent phase of that conflict was ended with the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement in 1998, but there continue to be these divisions, and you're seeing some of this come to a head at present for reasons we'll discuss, I'm certain.
Yeah. I want to ask a quick follow-up question. So, because I hear a lot of you kind of pushing back on the idea that this is about nationalism. A lot of historians have said the 20th century was the bloodiest on record, and they often cite nationalism as a cause. Of course, the kind of primary examples, for example, in Germany was a very concentrated state power that could use that and leverage it against different populations. What we have in all three of the cases, 4 cases here, is a subset of a larger body politic. So I'm wondering what you think vis-a-vis the critique that nationalism in sort of all forms, even if it's from a smaller sort of geopolitical unit, is potentially fraught with danger, or if there's some force for good. And Daniel, we can start with you, and if we can keep it kind of short, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Well, I think, Professor Gallaher, I think that if you allow me this reply, I mean, the problem here is probably the question. So when we put the secessionist movements within the frame of this kind of question, we realize that in many cases, what we see is a discourse that creates some nationalists or recognizes some nationalists, which are the ones creating the bad effects, and then the other actors are not perceived as nationalists. Mm-hmm. Let me be more clear. Most of these events in the 20th century that I agree were terrible and were totally devastating were created by state nationalism. And what we often see in this political analysis regarding nationalism is that the nationalists are always the sub-state nationalists, right? And then the central state actors are normally labeled, at least in Spain, for example, as non-nationalists. Mm-hmm. So in this kind of framing the question, I don't know, Pierre Trudeau, Tony Blair, or José María Aznar would be non-nationalists, and then Monsieur Parizeau or Monsieur Salmond or Monsieur Pujol would be very strong nationalists, right? That's what I think. It's analytically very poor. And then yet nationalism, good or bad? Well, yes. Well, nationalism allows for solidarity, allows for welfare state, and obviously also creates passions and demonstrations and things that create conflict. That I agree on that. Yeah.
That's a great way to flip the question. I like that. It makes us think about it very differently. Kimberly, do you want to jump in really quickly?
I did, and it put me in mind what Marc was just talking about. It put me in mind of John Hume. John Hume was the winner of the Nobel Prize for Peace, shared it with David Trimble, who was a Unionist. John Hume was the founder, or one of the early members of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, and he's thought of as, if you will, the intellectual midwife, a political midwife of the Good Friday Agreement. Much of what appears in the Good Friday Agreement came out of John Hume's vision. And one of the things that is a real marker of that is the fact that the Good Friday Agreement, as I said, which ended the sort of violent phase of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, used this phrase parity of esteem. And it refers to this notion that a unionist identity and a nationalist identity should be equally valued, right? That as Marc points out, only some groups are sometimes thought of as nationalists, the others are almost patriots. And so what part of the vision for resolving, or at least channeling, the conflict in Northern Ireland was to acknowledge that both groups had aspirations and that both groups' aspirations were legitimate and were to be resolved through the will of the majority and not through violence. And I think that that's a very important link in, as it's maybe not the nationalism as it is the expression of nationalism, its manifestations, the political institutional structure in which nationalism manifests itself.
Great, thanks. Well, I want to move on to the next round of questions, which I think of as sort of past. This question is the past prologue for what might be happening going forward. So far, none of the referendums or votes when they've happened, and they haven't in Northern Ireland yet, but when they have happened, they haven't yet delivered independence. So I wanted to turn now to understanding if those circumstances that were there in past attempts are still here today. And I'll start with you, Daniel. Why did the last attempt at separation in Quebec fail? And are those factors still in play today, or have things changed enough for another referendum?
Well, I would say, just commenting on what you said, is that, the healthy nationalism exists, and, our sub-nationalism are seen as unhealthy. But that's not true. When you have a nationalism that is democratic, that's open-minded, and I think that is the case of the movements in our respective countries and nations, and they're peaceful, except maybe in Quebec for a few years. There was this FLQ that was 50 years ago, and a lot of people that favored independence were their rights were breached. But in Quebec, the reason why I think in 1995 Quebecers didn't vote yes, but I recall that they voted yes by 49.42%, 50,000 votes short. And with people participating at the level of 94%, never seen in a Western democracy, is probably because of economic reasons. The case was made that if Quebec became independent, it would be economically non-viable, that it wouldn't be member of the G8 anymore, G7, and that made people scared, and obviously it had an impact. But we always like to remind that one of the reasons why it didn't succeed is maybe our opponents cheated. It was terrible what happened in 1995 in the no camp, and how much they poured money in the campaign without regards to our referendum laws. And they also, made accelerated grants of citizenship to people, obviously, that would vote no. So, next time around, if you want to know about what could happen, we'll have much stricter laws to prevent the cheating. And I think the economic factor will be less prevalent, and people are not scared of independence when it comes to the economy now. But we'll see what will happen.
Yeah.
We'll know when there is a third referendum.
Nicola, Scotland voted against independence in 2014, but it's still obviously a big part of Scottish politics. Can you tell us why?
Sure. I mean, the 2014 independence vote finished 55 against 45 in favour. So although that was a clear enough margin of victory to be accepted by everyone, there was no accusations of cheating or anything like that, it was also close enough to ensure that the debate would continue, and 45% then was historically quite a high level of support for independence. The reason why it is such a big issue, much bigger issue now than it was in 2014, is Brexit. And not just because the UK has left the European Union and 62% of Scots had voted in favour of the UK remaining within the European Union. It's the fact that that decision was taken despite this clear preference within Scotland. It goes back to those issues of voice that we were talking about at the beginning. So it's symbolic in a sense of the United Kingdom not governing in a way that recognises and accommodates its plurinational character. And so Brexit made a difference. Last time around, there was a referendum because the SNP had won a parliamentary majority. No other reason. There wasn't a grievance. And very different in a sense from Quebec and Catalonia, where you can pinpoint the moments at which things happened, the moments at which there was something occurred within the constitutional framework that people didn't like and they responded to. We didn't have anything like that in Scotland prior to 2014. In fact, there was broad satisfaction with devolution, with the way that Scotland was governed within the United Kingdom. That has changed, and that has changed largely because of Brexit and the Brexit process, but also now we have a dramatically transformed party political system where Scotland sends the overwhelming majority of its members of parliament in the London Parliament in Westminster represent the Scottish National Party, with no prospect of being in government. So we now have no prospect in the foreseeable future of a UK government that can be seen to be representative of Scotland's political preferences. And that has changed things. That's changed things to the status of Scotland within the United Kingdom. And then on top of that, of course, there is the issue of Scotland's relationship with what many still consider to be our European partners.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to you, Kimberly, next, because I think Brexit hovers over Northern Ireland as well. So the Good Friday Agreement stipulates that the British government can call a referendum on Irish unification if it looks likely to pass. For 23 years, that has not happened, but now all of a sudden there's a lot of talk on both sides of the border about a referendum happening. Why now?
How much time do we have, Carole?
Really, we need to do a secessionist movement for all of you individually, right? We need at least an hour for all of you. So not as much as we need.
So Brexit features quite prominently in the processes I was talking about of kind of this issue coming to a head. And that is in part because Northern Ireland, like Scotland, voted to remain in the 2015 vote. Did I get that right? 2015? Nicola, 2015, 2016?
16.
16, thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, 16, I was on mute.
Yes, sorry about that. Okay, so in the 2016 vote, 56% of Northern Ireland voted to remain. So that is underlying some of this for sure. Typically, if you look at the breakout of that referendum decision, Protestants, Unionists voted overwhelmingly, voted with some slight preference to remain. But of the people who voted to leave, the majority of nationalists did so, and also a slim majority of Unionists. So you get a clear sense that the majority would like to have remained. Although the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, was the only party there to campaign to remain. And so they found themselves, if you will, in kind of a political minority at that moment. When Brexit then has to be implemented, you've now encountered a whole host of problems with regard to particularly the status of Northern Ireland. Part of that is because since the Good Friday Agreement, the land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland has largely dissolved in terms of any border infrastructure. You could drive right across the border and not even know that you had crossed into a different sovereign territory. And that is because goods and services and people and capital could move freely across borders, internal borders within the European Union. However, when the UK withdraws from the European Union, then there has to be a border somewhere. And the question that was foremost in the negotiators' minds to a considerable extent was, where do you put that border? If you put the border back up on land between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, you would interfere in the peace process to a considerable extent. One thing, you would be restoring a border that was hotly contested and frankly a target of violence during the Troubles. For another thing, you would be interfering in the all-island economy that had evolved since the Good Friday Agreement, whereby goods were moved back and forth, sometimes multiple times in the manufacturing process, such that there were cows who grazed in some areas and their milk was harvested in other, and it was bottled somewhere else and churned and made into butter and cheese elsewhere, and etc., crossing the border multiple times. So those reasons caused a number of different constituencies to argue that you could not restore that land border. The only alternative, of course, is a border, as we say, down the Irish Sea, which in effect means that you will have customs checks for goods moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland that are destined to move on into the European Union. And either situation, as you can see, a land border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland would upset nationalists. A sea border, as we say, would upset Unionists, and that is, of course, exactly what has happened. But the other piece of this that is important to recognize is also demographic shift. So even though the majority in Northern Ireland opted to remain in the European Union, and a fraction opted to leave, the other issue is that nationalists, or if you will, Catholics, are coming to, the birth rate has changed. Protestants, or the birth rate has been high, and Protestants tend to leave. So their emigration rate is higher. And the balance between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland now is shifting such that Catholics are increasingly dominant and will appear to be the majority before long. Interestingly, the Good Friday Agreement does not stipulate on what grounds the British government must make its determination that a majority would support a united Ireland, and thus the calling of a referendum. And so there's considerable confusion. Should they rely on polling data? Should they rely on things like population demographic data? Or do they need other demonstrations, such as the rise to prominence of nationalist parties that would support a united Ireland? So there's a lot going on at present in this situation.
Right.
Nicola, did I say something wrong? Yeah, thank you.
Daniel, you had your hand up. Did you want to pop in really quickly?
Carolyn, just very quickly, I was thinking of what are the differences between these four issues, 4 countries. And it's a lot about referendum, who could initiate a referendum. And I'm always surprised to see that in the context of Northern Ireland, it's the UK that decides if you can hold a referendum. And the same thing seems to be the case in Catalonia. And the same case seems to be the case in the UK now, because the British government says, no, you can't do it now. We'll decide when you can do a referendum in Scotland. And what we've achieved in Quebec is interesting in terms of self-determination, because we decide if a government is elected that favors independence, it will hold a referendum, and Canada will participate. And the Supreme Court of Canada, in its 1998 reference on Quebec secession, acknowledged that. And that's what's interesting. It might make a difference.
Yeah. That's quite different.
And then the Good Friday Agreement gives Northern Ireland basically a legal mandate. Right, they are obliged, the British government is obliged to hold a referendum at the point at which it looks like a majority would support.
Let me ask on this, because I think this question for you, Marc, follows on what Daniel is saying. How likely is the Spanish government to negotiate with Catalonia's regional government on a path forward for independence, or at least self-determination?
Well, this is a good question and a very relevant one. While politics is the art of the impossible made possible, said Bismarck. So I think we can use this quote to have hope on that. There are some reasons to think that we are now in a different situation, or at least there are some reasons to think that the Spanish government could negotiate on these questions. First, there is a consensus in Catalonia on the idea that the anti-secessionist policy, or the policy from the central government, from Madrid, against Catalan secessionism has been more damaging than, have been more problematic than helping to the situation. I mean, putting these Catalan leaders on trial and then convicting them to very long prison sentences, and this repression and this law and order approach against any movement in favor of self-determination is not helping the situation. There is obviously a debate within Catalonia on independence and on the good faith or bad faith of this unconstitutional or wildcat referendum in 2017. But there is this consensus on the idea that Madrid policies should change on this question. The second thing is that there is now a different government in Madrid. During the last years, there was a conservative government in the Spanish central government, and now there is a coalition of leftist parties, the Socialists and Podemos. And at least Podemos is the minor partner in the coalition, is in favor of Catalan self-determination. So this is at least an element to take into consideration. And another important element is that this minority coalition in Madrid depends on Catalan supports in the Spanish parliament to achieve a parliamentary majority, to secure this parliamentary majority. So given all these factors, we are now in a better situation to think about the possibility of at least initiating a sort of talks or a negotiation table on the Catalan situation within Spain. I wouldn't say straightforward on self-determination, but at least on the Catalan position within the territorial model in Spain. The negative side, or the negative point here, is that there is a very, very strong opposition in the rest of Spain against this negotiation. The right and the far right, for the right party, the Partido Popular, the Conservative Party, and the extreme far right party Vox, this is a red line. This is a very, very relevant issue for their voters. They are very tough Spanish nationalists, and they totally reject any kind of negotiation with the Catalan parliament or the Catalan government on this question. And on top of that, the judiciary and the judiciary structure, which is centralized in the case of Spain, their members, the judges themselves, they are somehow politically biased on this topic, and we know that the majority of Spanish judges totally reject this kind of negotiations, and Spanish unity cannot be politically touched or cannot be discussed in the political arena. Right. So this is a hot topic, and I'm afraid I don't have an answer, but there are more chances to have thoughts on that.
Well, let me ask really quickly. I want to move down to this next sort of area I'm interested in, which is that if the place of interest that you all study was able to get what it wanted, which is, independence, or in the case of Northern Ireland, reunification or unification with Ireland, what would be the biggest challenges that it would face? And Daniel, I'll start with you.
I think it would be the adhesion of people to the idea that there's a new independent country, there's a new citizenship, especially in divided societies where you could win with 50% plus one or 52, 55%. I think that is a big issue, and you have to get people ready for that. And some will adhere, some won't, some will leave, like, English-speaking people in Quebec might not like the idea of leaving an independent Quebec. I think that is one of the greatest challenges for all of us if independence occurs. I would say negotiations with the government of the country we leave also, and Brexit has shown us that this turmoil when there's negotiations with the European Union is not necessarily good when it comes to the adhesion to this decision. And I think what lessons we've learned from Brexit is get ready. You should be much better prepared than the United Kingdom when it comes to negotiations after the referendum, post-referendum negotiations. Quebec was ready in 1995, but you'll never be ready enough to be at a good place on the negotiation table.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's fair to say the UK was not at all prepared for the fallout. Nicola, what do you think?
Yeah, the UK was not prepared because the referendum result was not the UK government's position. And the lesson from that is if you're a government, don't hold a referendum on something that you don't support. Mm-hmm. And so all that we had in the UK was a sort of glib phrase of Theresa May's at the beginning of her premiership was Brexit means Brexit, but we didn't have a clue what that meant, and neither did she. So it took a long time for the UK government to come to a view of what its priorities were at the time of the negotiations. And I cannot imagine a similar scenario in the context of a Scottish independence referendum where the proposition will be under much closer scrutiny, and it will be the platform of the party of government at the time, should we get to that point. In terms of the difficulties, one thing I was going to say in response to what Kimberly was saying, which I absolutely agreed with, by the way, was that, and actually one of the questioners in the chat was asking about cross-fertilization from Northern Ireland to Scotland. And absolutely, there is. The histories are very, very different. You talked about violence in relation to some nationalisms. It's often commented upon in relation to modern Scottish nationalism that nobody has had so much as a bloody nose. But in this case, in relation to the issue of borders, then there are parallel lessons. And that would be one of the biggest difficulties for Scotland, were it to accede to independence and at the same time look to rejoin the European Union, because the border between Scotland and England would then become a border between the European Union and the United Kingdom. And we've seen in relation to borders on the island of Ireland and between Northern Ireland and GP, indeed between Ireland and the UK, the sea border, that it raises difficulties. It raises difficulties not so much for people and movement, because for various reasons I don't foresee that being a problem, but in terms of a customs border and a regulatory border. And also a border of the mind. And I think the border issue is much more important because of Brexit than it ever was in the 2014 referendum. And I think that's perhaps the biggest challenge that architects of independence would have to confront if they were to win a yes vote and if they were to negotiate independence thereafter.
Right. Yeah, I remember seeing the trucks lined up. And I think it was coming from Calais into the tunnel, and it is it's a stark picture.
We're not even there yet, because
yeah,
the UK has not imposed the rules that it's supposed to do because it wants to ease those, and that may be prolonged. But yeah, we will see a fuller picture in due course.
Right, Marc.
Yeah, well, I think, regarding your question, I think that in the literature on the comparative politics of secession, we already have some clues on what would happen in a post-independence Catalonia, or what would be the difficulty there. I think there would be a clear external challenge regarding the rest of Spain and the Spanish government. How the Spanish government would internationally and domestically react to this situation. We already know what happened in 2017, and this is not very encouraging. So I think that in this process of decision in Catalonia, there should be somehow the consent from the Spanish government, or at least the toleration from the Spanish government that we did not see in 2017. But there would also be a very, very important challenge regarding the internal situation in Catalonia. Catalonia has there is no country that has their citizens, I don't know how to say that in English, but randomly distributed across its territory and social structure. There would be, important zones or areas in Catalonia against independence and other areas for independence. I don't think this should be a very, very important obstacle to the Catalan independence, but it could be an issue. The question of social cohesion and how many Catalan citizens against independence could feel aggressed, or could feel that as an assault against their own rights or their expectations. And this is extremely relevant. And we have the experience in 2017. We saw that, and we saw how just a vote on that, an unconstitutional vote, somehow created a very, very important debate, and also a wound into some people that felt uncomfortable with this situation.
Kimberly, challenges for Northern Ireland.
So first, I just want to make sure I clarified something in case I misspoke earlier, which is that the Unionists did vote with a majority to leave the EU. And so the point is that Brexit compounds the divisions that are already present, right? It's another cause for disagreement between Unionists and Nationalists. In terms of what Nicola was talking about in cross-fertilization, Carole, you and I wrote a paper for British Politics in which we looked at parliamentary debates around the first withdrawal bill. And it was fascinating because what ended up happening is that Northern Ireland remains part of the EU in terms of regulatory framework, and also part of the United Kingdom. And so arguably it has the best of all the regions of the UK, the best economic opportunities because it has a foot in both camps, or, can operate in both environments. And we saw in those parliamentary debates, the Scottish MPs saying, but wait, so a fish caught in Northern Ireland is going to be more caught in the waters and dragged to the coast of Northern Ireland will be more valuable than a fish caught in the waters and dragged to Scotland. And Scotland and Northern Ireland are 14 miles apart at their closest point. And the Scottish were saying that's not fair. And it's another reason that Brexit isn't fair for the Scottish. But in terms of what challenges would be there if a referendum ever passed, and let's just acknowledge that the referendum would be on this question of should Northern Ireland remain part of the United Kingdom or should it become part of a united Ireland? There is a fascinating report, and I recommend it to everyone, out of the University College London. Their constitutional unit pulled together a working group to consider the constitutional and legal issues surrounding such a referendum, because there's almost nothing in the Good Friday Agreement that spells out really what people would be voting on, because there's nothing in there that explains what a future other than remaining part of the United Kingdom would look like. And that's a very important set of issues, because when people go to cast a ballot, they would need to understand what the implications of that choice would be, right? Let's consider Brexit and the fact that people were promised, unicorns and rainbows, and no one in the context of the Brexit referendum debate really talked about the implications for the United Kingdom in terms of the commitments it had made in the Good Friday Agreement, right? And so you need to iron out those details. That report out of the Constitution Unit makes very clear that there are some very important issues that need to be sorted out before a referendum could take place, or at least a process to sort them out would need to be agreed before a referendum could take place. And in particular, I'll call your attention to the fact that the number one reason that would cause people in Northern Ireland to be skeptical about a united Ireland is not their nationalism, it's their healthcare, which is free at the point of service within the United Kingdom and done through private contracts in the Republic of Ireland. And so it's not nationalism that is driving those people so much as it is very practical considerations, such as what happens to our social welfare system, what happens to our healthcare. So a large part of the problem is getting some of those conversations to happen before you call a referendum. And a major hesitation there is that Unionists are not interested in having this conversation sort of as a group in general, and I'm overgeneralizing. But the Constitution Unit had a public discussion process in which they invited people to comment. And a lot of the comments that came into them were, even discussing this moves the agenda forward on it. Right? So we don't even want to be part of a discussion because you are driving us towards a unification referendum. And so to get the Unionists, I mean, imagine a situation in which you got a very close majority, something like we saw in the Brexit referendum, and then you had to govern the Republic of Ireland as a united Ireland with, 49% or 48% of people in Northern Ireland having not chosen that outcome. Right, and that we have a long tradition of violence, and we still have persistent paramilitarism in Northern Ireland, and these are the questions that need to be in some ways addressed before you jump into a referendum which you don't know its outcome and which could provoke further violence.
We're going to move now to COVID and how it affects or may affect how people see the state. So since the 1980s, neoliberalism has been the dominant ideology in most Western countries, albeit with pretty significant variation. And limiting the role of government has been a big part of that ideology. But the pandemic may have changed the calculation. What we call in the US, or what Republicans call in the US, starving the beast, has left many places unready to take care of the basics of dealing with COVID. Weak public health infrastructure, the inability to secure PPE and masks, the distribution of vaccines. So I'm wondering if you all think that COVID and the questions that this raises among the citizenry against the national government or the federal government, whatever it is in your particular place, is going to have a dampening effect, or it's actually going to have the opposite effect. And Daniel, we can start with you.
It might have a dampening effect in the short term, because obviously people, in Quebec, maybe it's this case in Scotland and Catalonia and Northern Ireland, are really concerned about their health and health issues more than independence and a referendum. So, but that won't last. And in a way, COVID has shown two very different things, that independence can be very useful. Maybe, I don't know what Nicola would think about that, but maybe some in the UK would say, well, that's great that we're not in the European Union anymore, because we were able to, decide on ourselves how we would deal with the issue and not have to wait for the European Union that's been very incompetent when it comes to COVID. So, having the powers on health issues, not depending on others, might be able a government to do things better, more competently. But on the other hand, independence has meant also, vaccine nationalism, and governments, independent governments trying to, stop vaccines to be exported, although they were produced by companies that have to respect their contracts. And the whole COVAX initiative, which is a great initiative, was put and maybe is in jeopardy because of the independence of countries that do not allow these vaccines to cross their borders. So it's very paradoxical that independence might be useful or not useful, and might be seen as a good tool or not a good tool for issues important as health and public health issues.
Nicola, what do you think?
It's very interesting, because last year, in the height of the pandemic, certainly the first and going into the second wave, support for independence in Scotland increased. We had about 20 or 21 opinion polls that showed support for independence being comfortably over 50%, up to 58%, I think was the highest one. And although it's impossible to say why that was the case, it correlated very strongly with distinctive perceptions of how well the Scottish Government and the Scottish First Minister were handling COVID, and their very poor perceptions of how the UK Government and the Prime Minister were handling COVID. So in some senses, COVID has made more visible in the United Kingdom the fact that there are 4 administrations, particularly given healthcare being at the centre and health policy being at the centre of COVID governance. We have had a situation in the UK where we didn't have the centralisation of power that you've seen in some federal states, nor did we have close intergovernmental collaboration, apart from in the very early emergency stages. But we have had 4 administrations doing similar things, but sometimes going off on their own as well. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but it did make multi-level government more visible in the United Kingdom. Now, what we've seen, and particularly in relation to the vaccine programme, where the UK government likes to pat itself on the back for how well it's been doing in terms of the vaccine rollout. I think others are catching up now, incidentally, but that's okay. But they like to talk about the vaccine programme and the broad shoulders of the UK government and then the UK as a country in terms of furlough and borrowing and all of these things, as demonstrating the strengths of the union, the benefits of the union. And it's not altogether clear that that's working. It certainly doesn't appear to be having much of an impact on public opinion. And that might be because of the visibility of the Scottish First Minister and the Scottish Government, including in managing the pandemic, in implementing a vaccine programme within Scotland. So it's not clear who gets the credit when things go well and who gets the blame when things go badly. But where I think COVID does matter, of course, is it makes the economic case for independence which is already quite difficult and challenging, but it adds a new dimension, a new challenge. If you're talking about in the near future, if you're talking about distribution of debt and share of debt and so on, then obviously the situation is a little bit different because of COVID, but that's not specific to a would-be independent country because all governments are facing these difficulties.
Marc, how's it affecting?
I agree with Nicola. It's a bit unclear the general effect of the COVID crisis, but I have at least, and I don't have evidence from the perspective of public opinion on the numbers on independence. I don't think it had a very strong effect on one side or the other side in terms of public opinion. But I think it's having three relevant impacts or three aspects that I think are important. First, from a practical perspective, the logistics or the practical situation, it's very, very complicated. So makes politics more complicated as our own normal lives. And I give you some examples. The Catalan leaders in jail or in exile, they are now facing more problems in terms of communication with their own political parties because of the COVID restriction. This looks like a very simple or very practical thing, but this has an impact in Catalonia because there were these elections in February here in Catalonia, and the elections took place in the middle of this pandemic. And obviously the restrictions had an impact on mobilization on the streets, communication between parties, and still has an impact on negotiations to form a new Catalan government because political leaders are less able to communicate each other, I think. There is also a relevant impact in terms of grievance. The extreme centralization of the Spanish government during the first wave of the pandemic and the first and the second waves was an important created an important grievance from Catalonia. Remember, the Spanish government, although Spain is a regionalized country and decentralized country, the Spanish government centralized all competencies during the first wave, and this state of alarm, or a kind of state of exception, prevented regional powers to act, and was the central government taking all powers, and this was a very perceived as a grievance from citizens. And then when this centralization phase gradually gave more margin of maneuver to the regional powers, this has led, and that's my opinion, this has created more interest for, as Nicola said, for which administration is managing each aspect of the pandemic. And I think there is a push for more realism and to use our administration, our regional administration, to its own purpose and to improve its efficiency and so on. So this is a sort of ambivalent effect of this pandemic.
Great. Kimberly, if you want to finish up with this question, and then we'll head into the Q&A.
Oh boy, Marc, has COVID complicated the politics in Northern Ireland? My goodness. So I would call attention to sort of three parts of this. One of them is the funeral of the IRA figure, Bobby Story, who died, and the funeral was last June during some of the strictest COVID restrictions, and many nationalist politicians attended, including the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, and there are images of hugging and kissing and crowds and people not wearing masks. And so about 2 weeks, I think it was March 30th, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, or Public Prosecution Service, announced it would not prosecute anyone for attending that funeral, which is one of the sparks for the recent violence within Loyalist areas, or the recent violence throughout, really starting in Loyalist areas. So layers of complexity there, and bad optics and, kind of a lack of trust. So that's part of it. Another is the EU decision, basically feels like vaccine nationalism within the EU, but basically to keep the vaccines within the EU means to actually effectually restore the border. And that was a brief moment in time, but to restore the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which, remember, is part of the United Kingdom. And that caused the Unionists to say, aha, you didn't want to put a border, but lo and behold, you can put a border when it's in your interest on land there. Also sowing, discord and distrust. And then lastly, when you have when you're two parts of an island and you have a pandemic, it's all the more reason to have all island-wide, regional infrastructure for dealing with public health and for regulating transit and the movement of peoples. So that also is a layer in all of this, which I know countervails some of the earlier comments. I would also point out that Daniel mentioned that that COVID will one day go away, please God. But whether the concerns about public health or the concerns about how the government is performing go away, I think is in some ways a separate matter. And what I mean by that is, one of the issues that Northern Ireland would have to sort out, or Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland would have to sort out in the advance of a referendum, is the question of the subsidy. So Northern Ireland taxpayers pay into the British Exchequer considerably less than they receive in terms of services. And there's very, I think, credible debate about exactly how much of that could be made up by a change in status, a constitutional status for Northern Ireland. But we're talking about something like, 10 billion pounds a year, possibly. And whether the Republic of Ireland and its 5 million citizens could absorb that amount in order to pay for public services in Northern Ireland relative to the 63 million people in Great Britain, is one of these questions. And so it's not just public health in the short term in the context of COVID that is controversial, but it's all of the other aspects of the social welfare system and the provision of pensions and healthcare in general, as well as the security infrastructure. So yes, COVID has complicated politics for sure, and added additional layers of challenge and colored the situation even further.
Carolyn, can I just add a little word? It was interesting. François Legault, the First Minister of Quebec, does press conference almost every day since the beginning of the pandemic. And when he compares the situation of Quebec, he compares it to other countries, not to the rest of Canada, but he compares to France, to Spain, to Europe. I don't know if that's something that happened in Scotland or in Catalonia, but some nations without states, compare themselves with states in the way they deal with the pandemic, which means that in a way, they think they are almost states, sovereign states.
Well, so we have a lot of questions here and not that many minutes. So I'm going to see if maybe one of, someone, whoever wants to jump in first to answer a question, and we can try to get through at least 2 or 3 of them. So both Suzanne Gase and Mitchell Macheski have asked a similar question, which is, can someone comment on the oft-cited worry that secession will encourage fragmentation of other countries and would therefore threaten the stability of the international system? And I don't know who would want to try to answer that.
The domino effect, we always hear about that domino effect. But when I hear that argument, I'd like to remind people that, in 1945, there were 50 members of the United Nations, and now there's 193. And in those new countries, there hasn't been necessarily a domino effect. And the issue is, at the end, should we, at recognize the concept of self-determination, democratic self-determination. And if we do that, there might be more countries, and there might not necessarily be more countries, because people will vote no, like they did in Scotland and Quebec. So I think it's a bad argument, the domino effect, because it's not it's an argument that doesn't deal with the main issue of democratic self-determination.
Kyle Marston asked a question which kind of gets at what you were saying a moment ago, Daniel, about comparing things to the end of World War II. And so he wants to know if anyone on the panel thinks that what we're seeing now compares to the various independence movements that came with decolonization after World War II. And he asked about Southern Sudan, or provide Southern Sudan as an example. Anyone want to jump in and answer that one?
May I add something?
Sure, Kimberly, and then Marc, you can jump in next.
So I can't really comment on South Sudan, but in terms of decolonization, arguably this is still part of that process in the United Kingdom playing itself out, right? That Ireland was a colony of the United Kingdom until, as I said, the rest of Ireland was granted a pathway to independence in 1920, or approximately. But this issue that of the last questioner about self-determination, it's so interesting to then ask yourself, well, self-determination of whom or by whom, right? And you could say, well, the majority in United Kingdom, or sorry, in Northern Ireland would like Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, at least for now. But the majority in Ireland would like Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic of Ireland. And so, what is the unit that we're talking about that gets to exercise self-determination? Do those units become smaller and smaller and smaller over time? Is that the domino effect? But the other point I wanted to make was, I'm thinking about Scottish independence and that referendum movement, Nicola, 2014, I think it was. And to remember that the government that introduced that referendum, yes, was the government of the Conservative Party. Am I right? And it is was I right about that? And it was
they didn't introduce the referendum, but they facilitated the transfer of power to the Scottish Parliament to empower it to introduce its own referendum law.
Thank you. The point I wanted to make is the party is called the Conservative and Unionist Party. That's its full title. And the British government was supposed to be a neutral arbiter of the Good Friday Agreement, which it signed in 1998. And then in 2014, to have the conservative politicians and the government that it directed stand up and talk about themselves as unionists. In the context of Great Britain, right, and Scottish independence, rang really strangely in the ears of people paying attention to the conflict in Northern Ireland. So, I think it's kind of a fascinating issue about, again, what unit are we talking about, and what is the cross-fertilization across units when we begin to use this language.
Thanks, Kimberly. You managed to get at Manu's question, and also I think Boaz at Celia's question. So Marc, did you want to provide an answer, and then Nicola, you can finish this up?
Yeah, just a quick comment on if these self-determination demands or these secession processes are the same as the ones in 1945. I think we are in a very different context now, and the independence processes we saw just right after the Second World War and during the 60s and 70s, most of them were related to colonization. And this was somehow supervised by the UN, and there were specific international resolutions regarding these territories. And so there is still this office within the United Nations on self-governing territories and so on. And some territories remain within this process. And what we saw in the late 80s was the dissolution of the USSR and then in the 90s Yugoslavia. And now what we see in Quebec, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, or in Catalonia are independence demands within the context of liberal democracy. And I think that we should take into account this factor. What we see here are democratic debates on the right to decide. And this is somehow different than a decolonization process or a state dissolution. These movements, most of them, they appeal to democratic expression, a democratic project, creating a liberal democracy. And what we see here is a different context and a different historical moment.
Nicola, do you want to have the last word before we close it out?
Yeah, just to clarify a little bit, something that Kimberly said, and just in relation to Scotland, Scotland was never a colony of the United Kingdom, and in the way that I have sympathy with the view that Ireland had a different kind of relationship. So it's a different kind of process here. And in 2014, David Cameron, who was then the Conservative Prime Minister, agreed to the referendum on independence, in part because of the majoritarian political culture that we have in the UK. The SNP won. They won an election. They had a manifesto commitment to independence, and he held up his hands and said, "You've earned the right." Now, that was partly linked to the idea of mandate, but it was also political calculation and being utterly convinced that it would be defeated. Now, that has changed now. It's no longer a sure thing that independence would lose in a referendum. And I would say the UK government has never been neutral when it comes to Scottish independence. It has a firm view in favour of maintaining the union, and it's a different kind of conception of union as the one that dominates within Scotland. But just to reinforce another thing that Kimberly was saying is that they were neutral in the peace process in Northern Ireland. And that has changed. And that has changed in ways that I find extraordinarily risky politically for the future of the peace process and the future of Northern Ireland.
I feel like we need another hour, but we are alas out of time. I want to thank all of you so much, Kimberly, Nicola, Marc, and Daniel, for being here. I hope we can bring you back to keep the conversation going in another event. I also want to thank the Transatlantic Policy Center here at AU for this Jean Monnet event. And I also want to remind you, we'll close out with a slide for our next talk for the Transatlantic Policy Center, which is going to be taking place on April 21st. Thank you all very much.